Before we begin, I want you to understand something about the signal. It lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds of compressed data fired across 47 light-years of empty space. By every standard of interstellar communication that the Vetian Concordat had established over 3,000 years of contact with other civilizations, it was nothing. A whisper. A hiccup in the void. The kind of transmission that gets logged, tagged priority low, and reviewed during the next scheduled maintenance cycle. Except the civilization that sent it had been silent for 11 years. 11 years of no response to diplomatic hails, no trade contact, no border activity, nothing. The working assumption across most of Concordat intelligence was that humanity had finally done what every model predicted they would do: collapsed. Too aggressive. Too internally divided. Too prone to burning their own infrastructure when they got frustrated. The models were unanimous. Species with that profile didn't survive contact with the pressures of an active interstellar theater. They burned bright. They burned fast. They burned out. That was the consensus. The signal changed the consensus. Not because of what it said. It didn't say much: fragmentary audio, partial coordinates, a tonal signature that our translation matrices had to run 3 passes to identify as intentional rather than interference. What changed the consensus was what happened after the signal. Within 6 standard hours, every human military vessel within range had changed heading. Not some. Not a detachment. Every single one. Ships that had been on completely unrelated operations, escort runs, survey missions, a diplomatic courier that had been threading the outer margin for cycles, all of them pivoted. Same vector. No coordination broadcast we could detect. No command signal we could intercept. They just turned. Like something enormous had opened one eye. My name is Sublegate Tharovis of the 14th Concordat Observation Fleet. I have spent the last 19 standard cycles documenting humanity for the Bureau of Emerging Civilizations. I have filed 412 reports on human behavior. I have been wrong, in one direction or another, in most of them. This is my account of what happened after that signal. I am filing it under a classification that does not technically exist yet. I have had to invent the category. The closest translation into standard is a warning disguised as a story. Read it that way. The signal came in on a dead channel. That was the first thing wrong with it. Channel 7 null was a legacy frequency, a leftover from the pre-Concordat era, before standardized interstellar communication protocols were ratified. Nobody used 7 null anymore. Nobody had used it in roughly 800 cycles. It existed in our systems as a historical artifact, a footnote in communications architecture. The kind of thing junior technicians stumble across during onboarding audits and ask about and get told don't worry about it by their supervisors. I only knew it existed because I have a minor compulsive habit of reading maintenance logs when I can't sleep, which is often because the bunk arrangement on Steady Inquiry, our observation vessel, a modified Concordat survey platform with all the architectural charm of a recycling processing unit, produces a low-frequency harmonic through the aft bulkhead that my secondary hearing organs cannot filter. I have submitted 7 formal complaints. I have received 7 formally worded non-responses. I have read approximately 6,000 maintenance logs. So when the alert chimed at 0340 ship time and flagged an incoming signal on a channel that, according to every protocol document in our system, did not receive incoming signals, I was already awake. I was sitting at my secondary console with a cup of refiltered algae broth that I will continue to insist tasted fine despite what Signals Officer Prethon says about it, and I was reading a maintenance log about the tertiary coolant manifold's calibration history. I set down the broth. The signal lasted 4 seconds. Then, it stopped. I sat with the silence for a moment, because in my experience, things that happen in the middle of the night on dead channels benefit from exactly 1 moment of careful consideration before you do anything about them. I have seen junior officers scramble a tactical response to censor ghosts. I have seen senior officers do the same, which is worse. Observation work rewards patience. This is something I tell myself often. My former supervising legate, Orelisthan, used to say that I had the patience of someone who had given up on the situation rather than someone who was managing it wisely, and that I should examine which one it was more carefully. I have examined it. I maintain that they are not always distinguishable. I pulled up the signal. Audio, mostly degraded. Partial coordinate string, margin sector, deep. And, beneath the static, something that my translation matrix flagged with a confidence rating I had never seen before and never wanted to see again, 97.3% certainty, human vocal origin. The second thing that was wrong, it wasn't a standard distress call. Concordat distress protocols have a specific structure. Species identifier, vessel designation, coordinates, nature of emergency, crew count. Humanity had been given those protocols during first contact 11 years ago. We had confirmed they received and understood them. There were 6 documented instances of human vessels using modified versions of those protocols in the years before the silence. This signal did not use any of that structure. What it used, what I spent the next 40 minutes cleaning up through 3 passes of the translation matrix, sitting alone in the dim blue light of the communications bay while the rest of my crew slept, was a name. And a location. And 9 words in heavily accented standard that I would go on to hear, in various forms, hundreds of times in the following months. Tell them Reeves is still breathing. We need the 6th. That was it. That was the entire signal. I will admit that my first response was to file it as anomalous and return to the coolant manifold report. This is not a proud admission. But I have been documenting humanity for 19 cycles, and in 19 cycles I had developed an elaborate internal system of ranked threat assessments, and a 4-second audio blip on a dead channel did not rank in the upper half of that system. Humans made noise. They transmitted noise. They were a civilization that had been pointed loosely at interstellar space and told there are others out there and had responded by immediately building more ships and talking louder. A garbled transmission from deep margin sector was statistically more likely to be a navigation error, an equipment malfunction, or, my working assumption for years, the kind of thing a human crew does on a boring long-haul transit when someone loses a bet. I filed it as anomalous. Then, I went back to the coolant manifold report. I had been reading for perhaps 12 minutes when Prethon arrived in the communications bay. She was one of 4 crew on steady inquiry, a junior signals analyst, vet species, which meant she was narrow and triple-jointed and processed sensory data through a distributed nervous network that made her extraordinarily good at pattern recognition and extraordinarily bad at dealing with situations that didn't have patterns. She was wearing her off-duty thermoweave and she had not yet run her morning scent calibration, which meant she smelled like sleep and stress pheromones and the particular chemical signature of a vet analyst who has noticed something. Sublegate, she said. You're awake early. My console flagged a secondary alert. She moved to her station with the careful, segmented precision of vet locomotion and pulled up her own display. The original signal. I was running a passive monitor on adjacent frequency bands as part of the quarterly calibration standard procedure. I wasn't expecting anything, and I picked up a secondary transmission. Different frequency. Different source. Same coordinates. I stopped reading about the coolant manifold. Same coordinates. Margin sector deep, yes. The secondary transmission is not audio. It's a data packet. Compressed. I haven't opened it yet because the encryption signature is. She paused, and her joints made the soft clicking sound that meant she was cycling through options. It's human. But it's not any human encryption format in our registry. There are 341 human encryption formats in the Concordat registry. Most of them were provided voluntarily during early contact negotiations. Some were reverse engineered. A handful were acquired through means that the Bureau of Emerging Civilizations officially describes as diplomatic intelligence gathering and that I would describe, more honestly, as the Concordat being exactly as morally flexible as every other major power when it thought no one was looking. None of them matched what Prethon was looking at. When was it transmitted? 4 minutes after the audio signal. I pulled up the navigation chart for margin sector deep. It's a bad neighborhood by any measure. Fringe space, past the last Concordat resupply post, in the corridor that runs between what used to be hegemony territory before the hegemony's administrative collapse 3 cycles ago and the contested buffer zones that nobody had formally claimed because formally claiming them would mean defending them. It was the kind of space where you found salvage runners and rogue operators and the debris fields of things that had gone wrong a long way from help. It was also, I noted with the specific sensation in my secondary stomach that I have learned to associate with situations becoming complicated, in the last known operational zone of the 6th Human Rapid Response Division. I say last known because the 6th had dropped off all Concordat monitoring about 8 months ago. Not gradually. Not the way units go quiet when they're in transit or communications dark by necessity. They had simply stopped appearing in any data we collected, no signals, no ship signatures, no border crossing records. The working assumption in my last quarterly report was equipment loss or full unit dissolution. Both were plausible. The hegemony's collapse had left a lot of things that used to be functional in various states of not being functional anymore. I had filed that report. I had been confident in it. Prethon, I said. See if you can break the encryption. I've been trying, she said. It's not responding to any standard approach. The architecture is strange. It's layered in a way I haven't seen before. The outer layer looks like a Concordat civilian format, which is why my monitor flagged it. But, underneath that, she stopped. Underneath that? I prompted. It looks like it was built by someone who knew our monitoring systems very well, she said. And, specifically engineered the outer layer to trigger our passive monitors. Sublegate, I think. She stopped again. Prethon does this. She processes in bursts and, then, gets stuck at conclusions she doesn't want to voice because her species' cultural framework treats premature conclusion stating as a form of social aggression. It is a quirk I have developed profound patience for, while finding it professionally maddening. Say it, I said. I think the signal was meant to be found. By us. Specifically. She clicked twice. The coordinates in the outer encryption layer match our current position exactly. Not approximately. Exactly. They knew where steady inquiry was before they transmitted. The algae broth had gone cold. I noticed this because I picked it up and it registered on my palp sensors as wrong, and I held it for a moment thinking about the manifold report and the quarterly assessment and the comfortable professional certainty that the 6th Human Rapid Response Division had dissolved. The passive monitor chimed again. New transmission. Same dead channel. Same voice. I could tell by the tonal signature, though the words were different this time, and the background noise had changed to something that my acoustic analysis identified as high-velocity whine through a compromised structure. An atmosphere. Gravity. Whatever this was, it was happening on a surface, not in space. I ran the translation matrix. Meridian, this is Reeves. Clock is at 40 hours. Tell the 6th what sector. They'll know where. Then, a sound I had no cultural framework for. A short, sharp exhalation of breath from the human vocal tract. My matrix had a notation for it, laughter, contextual, dark humor variant, but the notation felt inadequate. It did not capture the specific quality of that sound, the thing in it that registered on my secondary hearing organs as something my species would produce when the alternative was a sound we did not want to make. Tell them I said hi. Signal end. I sat with it for a long time. Long enough for Prethon to pull up everything in our registry on a human operative designation I had cross-referenced immediately, Reeves. It was a surname. Common enough in human naming conventions. There were hundreds of documented individuals with that designation in our records. But, the 6th Rapid Response, cross-referencing the 6th, margin sector, and the operational period, narrowed it considerably. One match at the relevant classification level. Staff Sergeant Adiz Reeves, Human Commonwealth Armed Services, assigned to the 6th Rapid Response Division's Forward Reconnaissance Element. Last confirmed status report, 10 months ago, in a Concordat intelligence summary that I had written myself and that classified her element as status unknown, presumed non-operational. I had written that. 10 months ago. With confidence. She had just sent us a message from a planetary surface 47 light-years away, on a dead channel, in an encryption format that didn't exist in our registry, engineered to find us specifically, and she had done it casually, the way you'd send a message to someone you'd been meaning to get in touch with. I pulled up the navigation chart again. Prethon was already running a course calculation. How far? I asked. At maximum transit, 11 days. She clicked. But, sublegate if I'm right about the encryption. If this was targeted to us, specifically, then, someone knew where we were, I said. And, wanted us to come. Yes. She paused. That could mean many things. It could. I thought about the 6th. 8 months of silence. The comfortable certainty of dissolution. The way the signal had come in on a channel nobody used, timed perfectly after the audio blip, layered with a fake exterior to catch our monitoring system. Someone had been very patient. Or very busy. Possibly both. I thought about the word 40 hours. A clock. She'd said clock is at 40 hours. In human military communication, that phrasing had a specific meaning, and the meaning was not good. It meant something was happening at the end of 40 hours regardless of whether she was there or not. It meant she had started something and the starting could not be undone. I thought about 9 words. Tell them Reeves is still breathing. We need the 6th. Still breathing. Not I'm alive. Not I'm okay. Not any of the 100 soft ways you could communicate survival. Still breathing. The choice of that word, still, carrying the specific weight of something that had been in question and had not been resolved in the way that would make the question unnecessary. I authorized the course change. Prethon began calculating. I refilled the algae broth. It was still wrong temperature, but I drank it anyway, standing at the viewport while the stars rotated as steady inquiry came about, and I thought about the 19 cycles of reports I had filed on humanity, and the comfortable professional distance I had maintained from the species in those reports, and the part of my quarterly assessments where I had written, in measured bureaucratic language, that the probability of humanity becoming a significant factor in the margin sector security situation was low and declining. The dead channel remained silent. It didn't need to say anything else. I had already been told everything. We were 6 days out when the 6th found us. Not when we found them. When they found us. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters when you are trying to explain, in an official report to the Bureau of Emerging Civilizations, why a Concordat observation vessel that was traveling under standard silent running protocols toward a classified coordinate set was intercepted, boarded, and briefly occupied by elements of a human military unit that was officially considered non-operational. At no point during the intercept did any of it feel like an attack. That is the other thing I want to be precise about. They moved through the hull access procedures so smoothly that Prethon's proximity alerts gave us 9 seconds of warning rather than the usual 40, and, in those 9 seconds I had time to stand up from my console, put down my broth, and watch the access hatch in the communications bay open. The human that came through it was not large, which was my first note of confusion, because everything in the cultural material on human military units implied large. She was perhaps average height for her species, which meant she was still configured in a way that took up space in a manner I found physiologically unjustified for an organism that mass. She was wearing composite armor that had been repaired in at least 6 places with materials that were visibly not original components. I could see 2 different alloy colors in the shoulder plate alone, and what appeared to be a polymer patch on the lower thoracic section that had been heat-sealed rather than welded, which meant whoever did it either didn't have proper tools or didn't have time to use them. Probably both. She was holding a sidearm. Not pointed at anyone. Just held, low, the way you'd carry something you needed available. Her eyes moved around the communications bay with the kind of systematic sweeping motion that my behavioral analysis training identified as tactical assessment and that my personal instincts identified as this individual has been in small enclosed spaces that turned out to be dangerous many times and has not stopped expecting that to happen. The scar tissue running from her left jaw to below her collar. The way her weight was distributed slightly forward, on the balls of her feet. The faint discoloration under her eyes that indicated the kind of chronic sleep deficit that human physiology can sustain before significant degradation, but not indefinitely. All of this I registered in approximately 2 seconds. Then, she looked directly at me and said, "You're the Rovas." It was not a question. It was a statement delivered in standard with the specific accent pattern that my registry identified as West African origin, overlaid with the flattening that comes from years of using a second language as a primary operational one. "I am," I said. Because denying it seemed pointless. "Good." She lowered the sidearm the rest of the way. "We've been watching your approach since you left your last position. You came fast. That was the right call." She glanced at Prethon, who had gone completely still in the way that Veth analysts do when their pattern recognition systems are overloaded and haven't yet produced a category to file the experience under. "We need your communications array. Ours is compromised." "Who are you?" I asked. Though I already knew, because I had been running the match against my registry since she came through the hatch. The architecture of the face. The scar. The armor repair patterns consistent with the operational profile. "Reeves," she said. "Staff Sergeant. You got my messages." "I got your messages." She nodded like this was a checkbox cleared. "How many crew?" "4, including myself. We have 6 coming aboard. They'll stay out of your way." She was already moving toward my primary console, reading the display with the same systematic sweep she'd given the room. "I need to show you something before I explain the situation, because if I explain the situation first you're going to want to file a report before you understand why you can't do that yet." I processed this. "You're asking me to look at something before I decide whether to report it. I'm telling you there's a sequence that works better than the other sequence." She looked up from the console. Her eyes were the specific brown of deep soil strata, and there was nothing in them I could read except attention. Pure, patient, clinical attention, the kind that doesn't telegraph intention because it isn't doing anything except measuring. "I know what you think happened to us. I wrote the report you probably used as a source. Before I went in. The second thing wrong. First the dead channel. Now this. You wrote, 'I'm an intelligence analyst who got shuffled into a field slot when we lost 2/3 of our specialist staff in the first 4 months of the hegemony collapse.' The sixth was, 'It's complicated.'" Something crossed her face. A compression of the musculature around the eyes that my behavioral index coded as suppressed, grief-adjacent, operational context. Gone in a fraction of a second. I've been filing status reports through a Concordat journalism license held by a non-existent correspondent for the last 8 months. Someone in your bureau has been receiving them and marking them unverified low priority without reading past the header. I stared at her for long enough that Prethon made the clicking sound she makes when she thinks I should say something. "That is," I started. "A pretty significant bureaucratic failure, yes. Not an accusation. A statement of fact, delivered with the same clinical neutrality as everything else. I'm not interested in the failure right now. I'm interested in the situation. Are you going to let me show you the situation?" There is a concept in Vetian culture, prethsol, that translates loosely as the moment when continuing to walk in the direction you are walking will take you somewhere you cannot walk back from. Prethon's species has the same concept and uses a longer word. Most species with sufficient self-awareness have some version of it. It describes a threshold, the specific cognitive recognition that a choice is no longer reversible once made, and that the recognition itself is already a kind of making. I was in a prethsol. "Show me," I said. What she showed me took 40 minutes and involved a holographic display built into a device she pulled from her kit that was not any human technology in my registry, which meant it was either new or it had been built from components sourced outside normal supply chains, which told its own story. The display was thorough. It was precise. And it was the most methodically organized intelligence briefing I had received in 19 cycles of observation work, not because the content was tidy, but because the structure of it showed someone who had been sitting alone with a problem for a very long time and had organized every piece of it into exactly the right sequence to be understood by someone coming to it cold. I will not reproduce the full briefing here, because portions of it remain at classification levels that do not exist yet, and I am still in the process of inventing the appropriate categories. The summary is this: the hegemony's administrative collapse was not organic. Portions of it were induced. Not by the Concordat. I want to be clear about this because the Bureau will ask, but by a third-party actor that Reeves's intelligence had been tracking for the better part of 2 years and that she had been filing reports about for 8 months under a journalism license that a functionary in our Bureau had been marking unverified low priority without reading. The third party had a name in the Sixth's internal documentation. I will use that name, the Scion Compact. A coalition of former hegemony administrative bodies that had not dissolved but had migrated, moved assets, personnel, and infrastructure into the margin sector buffer zones during the chaos of collapse, using the confusion as cover. They had spent 2 years building something in the buffer zones. Specifically, they had been building it on the planet whose surface coordinates matched the second transmission. Reeves's reconnaissance element had gone in to verify. 6 months ago, they found what was being built. At this point in the briefing, she paused. She had not sat down for the entire 40 minutes. She stood beside the holographic display and moved through it with the pointing gestures of someone who had given this presentation many times, in her head, in the dark, preparing. At the pause, she reached into a pocket on her thigh rig and pulled out a container I recognized as a human food item, a compact ration block of some kind, and ate approximately half of it standing up, without ceremony, the way you'd take medication. When was the last time you, Prethon started? Yesterday, Reeves said. Which did not answer the question Prethon was actually asking. She put the other half of the ration block away and pointed back at the display. The clock I mentioned in my transmission. 40 hours. That was the window before the compact executes the next phase of construction, which involves moving something from the surface facility to orbit. Once it's in orbit, the logistics change significantly. What is it? I asked. What are they building? She looked at me for a moment. That specific quality of attention again, patient, measuring. You know what the hegemony was best at, she said. Before the collapse. I knew. Every intelligence analyst who had ever studied the hegemony knew. The hegemony's primary export, for the last 400 cycles of its existence, had been military architecture. Warship design. Weapons systems. They were very, very good at it. Better than anyone else in this sector of space. One of the reasons their collapse had been simultaneously catastrophic and chaotic was that the redistribution of their military-industrial infrastructure had happened without any controlled handover. Assets and personnel had scattered in every direction, some to Concordat space, some into private hands, some to exactly the kind of groups that you would specifically not want to have access to that level of capability. Yes, I said. They'd been finishing it, she said. What we found. She pulled up the final image in the briefing, a schematic, partially reconstructed from reconnaissance data. I studied it. Prethon studied it. I heard the click-click-click of Prethon processing rapidly and reaching a conclusion she didn't want to voice. I started. We've been calling it the needle, Reeves said. Because that's what it does. Penetrates shields. Any shields. At range. She closed the display. The compact doesn't need a large fleet if they have the needle. They just need the needle. The communications bay was quiet. The harmonic from the aft bulkhead was doing the thing it does. I had submitted 7 complaints about it and received 7 non-responses, and in this moment I found it oddly comforting, the way familiar minor annoyances are comforting when the large things have stopped having familiar shapes. You said you need the 6th, I said. Your transmission. I sent for them 6 weeks ago through a different channel. They're coming. She said it with a flatness that didn't perform certainty but simply had it, the way you'd say water is wet. Not because it couldn't be otherwise, but because the alternative had been decided against a long time ago. I need your communications array because mine is compromised and I need to coordinate the approach. The compact is monitoring all registered Concordat frequencies. They're not monitoring your array because a Concordat observation vessel doesn't have a communications array that could reach the sixth at that distance, I said. Which was technically true. Under standard configuration. She looked at me. Prethon modified it, I said. Last year. For the quarterly monitoring expansion. Prethon clicked. It is technically outside Bureau parameters for an observation class vessel. Did it work? Reeves asked her. Yes, Prethon said. A pause. Very well. Then, I need it. She looked back at me. And, I need to explain something about the Sixth's approach protocol before we bring them in, because the compact has listening assets in this sector and, the coordination has to be done in a format they won't recognize. What format? She told me. I will include this in the full report when I develop the appropriate classification. I will only note here that what she described was not a military encryption standard. It was not a Concordat format or any known variant. It was a communication method built from a combination of a pre-spaceflight human coding system, a private notation developed by the Sixth's intelligence element during the hegemony collapse operations, and, this is the part one found hardest to process, what she described as an oral tradition encoding system from one of the small cultural linguistic groups represented in the Sixth's personnel roster. Someone, at some point, had looked at the problem of communicating without being understood by any known monitoring system and had thought, what if we used something so old, and so specific, and so local, that nobody who hasn't been in a particular valley on a particular continent of a particular planet would even recognize it as language? And, then, they had built a military encryption protocol out of it. I thought about the Bureau functionary marking 8 months of reports unverified low priority. I thought about the comfortable assumption of dissolution. I thought about the way Reeves had built the briefing in exactly the right sequence to be understood by someone coming to it cold, because she had been planning for someone coming to it cold for a very long time, planning for the specific shape of the bureaucratic failure that would mean the first outside contact would be an observer who hadn't read the reports. She had planned for us. Specifically. She had known what we knew and what we didn't and what we'd need to know first. How long have you been on that surface? I asked. 6 months, she said. With how many personnel? A pause. The compression around her eyes again. Gone fast. What I've got, she said. Which was not a number. I did not ask again. There are questions where the asking is a form of cruelty, not because the answer is secret but because making someone say the number out loud accomplishes nothing except making them say the number out loud. Show Prethon the encoding system, I said. We'll open the array. Reeves nodded. She moved toward Prethon's station with the same forward-weighted walk, the same economy of motion. I watched her eat the other half of the ration block while Prethon pulled up the array controls. Then, I went back to my console and looked at the navigation chart for the margin sector deep, at the coordinates that were now 47 light-hours closer than they'd been when I first plotted them, and I tried to estimate, from 6 months on a compromised surface, with whatever personnel she had left, building a communications network out of dead channels and journalism licenses and oral tradition encoding, how much of the Sixth's survival over those 6 months was operational discipline and how much was something else. Something harder to classify. I could not find the right measurement unit. My species has very precise measurement units for survival probability and resource management and strategic endurance. None of them were designed around spite as an operational input. The dead channel opened again, but this time it was Reeves who opened it, sitting at Prethon's station, running something through our array that I could not parse. She spoke briefly in a sequence of sounds that my translation matrix processed and immediately flagged as no match, possible language, insufficient corpus, and then closed the channel. 12 hours, she said to me. The Sixth will be here in 12 hours. How do you know they received it? Because they're already coming, she said. I sent a shorter version 2 days ago when I picked up your approach vector. This was just the specifics. She leaned back in Prethon's chair in a way that Prethon looked at with what I interpreted as professional violation and personal fascination. They're going to want a briefing when they arrive. I can run it, but it'll move faster if you back me up on the Concordat intelligence sections. You want me to brief a human military unit. I want you to help me brief the people who are about to stop the compact from deploying a shield-penetrating weapons platform into this sector's orbit. She said it the way she'd said the sixth was coming. Not as though it were certain, but as though it had already been decided, and the deciding was the kind that didn't come undone. After that, you can write whatever report you need to write. I'll give you everything. All of it. 8 months of data. I'll sign whatever I need to sign. A pause. I just need the next 14 hours first. The harmonic from the aft bulkhead was very loud in the silence. I thought about my 7 complaints and their 7 non-responses. I thought about the report I had written 10 months ago classifying her element as status unknown, presumed non-operational. I thought about the 40 hours on the clock and the thing in orbit and the bureau functionary. Prethon, I said. Get the second briefing room configured. Prethon clicked twice. It is configured, she said. I configured it 11 minutes ago. Of course she had. I looked at Reeves. She was looking at the navigation display, at the coordinates she had given us. Her face was unreadable from the angle, just the line of her jaw and the scar and the hollow under her eye from the sleep deficit. She had one hand resting flat on the console surface. I noticed and then kept noticing, which was the problem, that 3 of her fingers on that hand had been broken and healed and broken again, the joints thickened with the specific architecture of repeated damage and recovery. Not battle injury. Work. The accumulated record of a very long time doing something that was hard on the hands. She was 31 years old. I had pulled her file. 31 standard years, which in my species equivalent is barely past the first assessment threshold. The age at which a Concordat officer would still be completing their foundational training rotation. I picked up my broth. It was cold again. I drank it anyway and did not file a complaint about the temperature because some things you reach a point of accepting. Not because you've stopped noticing. Because noticing has become the thing itself. The 6th arrived in 11 ships. I had expected more. I realize, writing this, that the expectation was itself revealing that I had built a picture of the 6th Human Rapid Response Division from the briefing materials and, from the 8 months of intelligence in Reeves's encrypted files and, from the way she had spoken about them, and the picture I had built was something large. Something that matched the scale of what they had apparently been doing in the margin sector silence. 11 ships. 2 of which were barely operational by any standard I could verify from our sensor array. One of them was running on 3 of its 4 drive units and had jury-rigged a thermal regulation bypass that my engineering analysis flagged as functional but extremely inadvisable. Another had hull scoring consistent with repeated proximity detonations over an extended period, not one battle. Many battles, spread across time, each one leaving its record in the alloy. I watched them come in on the display and I counted the scoring and I thought about 8 months of silence and I thought, this is what it looks like to not stop. Reeves was standing beside me at the display. She watched the ships come in with an expression I could not fully categorize. There was something in it that was not relief exactly. Relief implies the resolution of fear. This was different. This was the specific quality of someone who has been holding something up for a very long time and has not yet accepted that the weight is about to be shared. She didn't say anything. She watched the ships. The 6th's commanding officer came aboard steady inquiry 90 minutes later. His name was Captain Emeka Okafor, a tall human with a shaved head and the specific kind of deliberate stillness that I have learned to identify in human officers who have trained themselves out of the fidgeting their species defaults to under stress, not because they weren't stressed, but because they had decided fidgeting was information they didn't want to give away. He arrived with 4 members of his staff, none of whom I will name individually because 2 of them I have not yet been able to verify the classification status of and the Bureau will want this filed carefully. He and Reeves looked at each other for approximately 3 seconds when he came through the hatch. No greeting I could parse. Something passed between them in that 3 seconds that was entirely in the domain of expression and posture, and What I read from it was complex in a way that my behavioral analysis training was not designed to handle. It was not the reunion of people who were glad to see each other, or the relief of command contact restored, or any category I had a clean name for. It was more like the specific acknowledgement between two people who have each been keeping an internal count of something and just confirmed, in that 3-second exchange, that their counts matched. Then, Okafor said, "You look terrible." And Reeves said, "You're 2 days late." We had a detour. He glanced at me. "Sublegate Tharovis. I've read your work. I've apparently been filing some of it as low priority," I said. A corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. "Some of what you wrote about us was accurate," he said. "Some of it was about a different species." I chose not to argue the point. I gave him the full intelligence briefing instead, with Reeves running the holographic display, the two of them moving through the sequence with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me they had covered this material together before. Not all of it, not in this format, but the architecture of it was familiar to both of them in a way that came from sharing the same problem for the same duration. The briefing took 22 minutes. Okafor asked 4 questions. 2 of them were about the needle's orbital insertion window, and I answered them as precisely as my data allowed. One was about the compact sensor coverage of the insertion corridor, which Reeves answered from memory without consulting her files. The 4th question was the one I had not expected. How many does the facility have below the surface? He was looking at Reeves when he asked it. The workers. Not the compact personnel. Reeves didn't answer immediately. The pause was short, barely perceptible, but it was there. Approximately 400, she said. Maybe more. They were recruiting through the collapse. A lot of displaced labor from the hegemony administrative sectors. Awareness? Mixed. She set down the pointer she'd been using for the display. Some of them know what they're building. Some of them think it's a standard heavy industry contract. The ones who figured it out, she stopped. Started again. Some of them have been helping us. Okafor nodded slowly. He was looking at the schematic of the facility on the display. The needle, partially built, extending up from the surface in the schematic like exactly the thing they had named it for. Then, the approach has to account for that, he said. I know. It complicates the timeline. I know, Reeves said again. And then, with a flatness that was not arguing and not resigned, something precise and specific that I did not have a category for, that's why I called you instead of handling it from the surface. I will record what happened in the next 6 hours because that is my function, and because the Bureau will want a complete account, and because I believe this part of the record is important in ways that will become clear to whoever reads this when the appropriate clearances are developed. What happened is this: the 6th planned an operation in 6 hours that accounted for a weapons platform, a fortified surface facility, approximately 300 compact operatives, 400 non-combatant workers with varied degrees of complicity, an insertion corridor monitored by compact sensors, and the specific logistical constraint that the operation had to be completed before the needle's orbital insertion window opened or the entire strategic situation changed in ways that would require a much larger force than 11 damaged ships. I sat in the briefing room for most of those 6 hours. I was not invited to the planning sessions and I did not insert myself. I could hear them through the bulkhead, not words, mostly, but the cadence of planning, the specific back and forth rhythm of people building a plan collaboratively, where one voice would lay out a sequence and another would interrupt with a constraint and a third would propose a modification and the first would come back with an amendment. Fast. Not chaotic. It did not have the quality of chaos. It had the quality of something very practiced being done under time pressure, which is a different thing entirely. Prethon sat at her station and ran what analysis I asked her to run and flagged things I hadn't asked for because she had determined they were relevant. At one point she calculated the compact sensor coverage and found a gap in it, a narrow, irregular gap, and brought it to me and I passed it to Okafor's staff and 20 minutes later I heard the cadence in the next room shift, the kind of shift that means a constraint just dissolved. I did not flag this in my log as intelligence assistance to human military operation. I flagged it as sharing analysis relevant to civilian non-combatant safety, because that was the accurate description and because when I eventually file the full report, I want the framing to be defensible. At hour 5, Reeves came out of the planning room and sat down across from me at my console. She had eaten again a different ration block, same ceremony-free method. She looked at my algae broth and did not comment on it. I consider this a mark of professional respect. The workers, she said. The ones helping us. We got a signal from the lead contact inside the facility an hour ago. They've been distributing markers, so the approach team can tell the difference. She looked at the console surface. 43 markers. In 400 people. Distributed by hand, in a facility under compact surveillance, over a period of 3 weeks. I processed this. How were they distributed without detection? Quietly, she said. Which was the entire answer. I thought about 43 people in a facility building a weapon they had gradually understood was a weapon, who had made a decision about what to do with that understanding and, then, acted on it over 3 weeks with enough operational patience to not get caught. Not soldiers. Not intelligence operatives. Workers. People who had taken a contract during a collapse because they needed the work and had arrived at a situation they had not signed up for and had responded to it by doing the quiet, patient, risky thing. I thought about the human who had looked at the problem of communicating without being understood by any known monitoring system and built an encryption protocol out of an oral tradition from a particular valley. I thought about 7 complaints and 7 non-responses. There is a word in my species language, velthan, that describes the specific cognitive recalibration that happens when accumulated small evidence finally resolves into a pattern you should have seen earlier. It's not a comfortable sensation. It involves a kind of retroactive embarrassment that is physiological as much as cognitive, a heat response in the secondary circulatory system, a change in olfactory output, a slight dimming of visual acuity as the processing load redistributes. I was experiencing velthan. Sitting at my console at hour 5 of a planning session on a modified observation vessel, drinking cold algae broth, I was experiencing velthan about 19 cycles of reports. You're going in with them, I said to Reeves. The approach. Yes. Your clock was a deadline for calling them. Not a deadline for waiting. She looked at me. The patient, measuring attention. I needed them here before the window, she said. I needed them briefed and operational. And I needed to know the Concordat had this on record. She paused. Someone needed to know what's down there. Even if the operation doesn't, she stopped. Especially if the operation doesn't go the way we're planning. This was the closest she came, in any of our conversations, to acknowledging that the operation might fail. She said doesn't go the way we're planning, and she said it with the clinical flatness of an intelligence analyst completing a risk matrix, not with the quality of someone imagining failure. It was a sentence she had prepared. A sentence that existed in a mental filing system alongside all the other prepared sentences she had ready for the possibilities. She had been on a planetary surface for 6 months with whatever personnel she had left, and she had been planning for this outcome too. I should file something, I thought. I should flag this. There was a procedural sequence that the Bureau had for situations of this classification level. There were forms. There were authorization chains. There was a process that existed precisely so that situations like this one were not handled by a sub-legged observation officer making unilateral decisions in a communications bay. I thought about the Bureau functionary. 8 months. Unverified low priority. What do you need from me? I said. She told me. The operation began at hour 6.5, which was 31 minutes ahead of the insertion window. I watched it from Steady Inquiry's sensor array not because I had a useful role to play in what happened on the surface, but because watching was the thing I was here to do. It was my function. It was what I had trained for. 19 cycles of watching and recording and filing, and this was the thing worth watching. I will not pretend I was objective. I will not pretend that what I experienced as I watched the 6th approach vectors converge on the facility, as the compact's sensors picked up the main force and pivoted toward it, which was the plan, the main force as the distraction, the pivot as the point, was the clinical detachment of a properly functioning observer. I had cold broth and a harmonic in my aft bulkhead, and I had Prethon beside me clicking in the compressed rapid pattern that meant her pattern recognition was running at full load and finding things. The compact's response was fast. Faster than our projections. They had more personnel in the facility than the intelligence suggested, by about 30%, which was a significant variance, and I watched the tactical display as the 6th approach teams encountered it and adapted in real time without breaking contact. Not smoothly. There was a period of approximately 7 minutes where the display showed the kind of clustered activity that means things have gone sideways from the plan and the people involved are rebuilding the plan from inside the sideway thing. 7 minutes. Then, the activity pattern shifted. I do not know what happened in those 7 minutes. I was not on the surface. The communications traffic I was relaying through our array was in the encoding format Reeves had shown Prethon, and my translation matrix was still flagging it NO match, and Prethon, who had spent the planning hours studying the encoding and had, because she is Prethon, made significant progress, told me two things: that the traffic in those 7 minutes indicated a plan change, and that the second element of the plan change had been Reeves's call. Reeves's call. From inside a compact facility. In an operation that was already 30% under-resourced. The needle never reached orbit. I do not know the exact sequence of events that produced that outcome, and I will not speculate beyond what the data supports. What the data supports is this: the needle's orbital insertion systems were disabled at 41 minutes into the operation, 2 minutes before the window opened. The compact's command structure collapsed within the following 20 minutes. The facility's non-combatant workers, most of them, not all, some had to be convinced by other means, were sheltering in designated areas marked by 43 small objects distributed over 3 weeks. The workers were not harmed. I know this because I was the one relaying the status confirmations through our array, in the encoding format, in the early morning of steady inquiry ship time, sitting with cold broth and Prethon's clicking and the aft bulkhead harmonic, watching the confirmation codes come through one by one. And I know it because Okafor's staff told me, as the operation concluded, that the 43 markers had held. That the people who had spent 3 weeks passing small objects quietly through a surveilled facility had been right to do it. That their patience had been the thing that kept them safe. Reeves came back aboard steady inquiry 2 hours after the operation concluded. She sat down across from my console again. She did not look better, exactly, but she looked different, the way a load-bearing structure looks different when the load has been redistributed. The tension at the corners of her eyes that I had been reading as chronic stress was still there, but it had lost something. Not relaxed. Something more like rearranged. She picked up my cold broth from the console. Looked at it. Set it back down. "You're going to file a report," she said. "Yes. Bureau is going to have questions. Many. I'll submit to a formal debrief. Full cooperation. I'll bring in the whole 8 months of data." She looked at the console surface. "I need a few days first." "For what?" "The workers in the facility. Some of them have nowhere to go." She said it plainly. "We're coordinating transport for the displaced personnel. Most of them, they don't have anything to go back to. The hegemony's gone. The contracts are void. They need," she paused. "We're working on it." I looked at her. The sleep deficit. The broken and healed fingers. The 6 months. After the needle, I said. After the operation. "You're coordinating displaced labor transport." "We have the ships," she said. "They need the ships." A beat. "It's not complicated." I thought about this. I thought about the specific quality of "it's not complicated," the way she said it, with the same flatness as everything else. Not a dismissal. Not a simplification. A genuine expression of the internal logic: I have a thing, they need the thing, therefore. No transaction. No calculation. Just the direct line from having to giving. Prethon's clicking had gone very soft, which is the pattern she makes when she is paying close attention to something and does not want to interrupt it. I did not have a word for what I was observing. I have been looking for one since. I have gone through all 3,042 entries in the Standard Emotional Classification Index, which covers 37 species across 40,000 documented behavioral patterns, and I have not found a word for the specific combination of exhausted past the point of recovery, still upright, redirecting the remaining capacity toward a problem that was not the original problem and that nobody assigned and that nobody would notice if it went undone. The closest I have found is Velthan, my species word for the moment of recalibration, but that's my experience of watching it, not the thing itself. I am fairly sure humanity has a word for it. I have not asked. I filed the initial report 22 hours later, after the 6th had completed the transport coordination for the facility's displaced workers, 412 people, who were now being routed towards several Concordat resettlement hubs through a logistics chain that Okafor's staff had apparently been building in parallel with the operation planning. I filed it under the new classification I had invented. I described the needle. I described the compact. I described the operation. I did not, in the initial report, spend significant space on the 43 markers passed through a surveilled facility over 3 weeks. I did not describe Reeves sitting across from my console eating a ration block without ceremony. I did not describe the aft bulkhead harmonic or the cold broth or the 7 complaints or Prethon's clicking. Those things are in this report. The one I am still writing. The one I don't know what to do with yet, except file it, and trust that someone who receives it will read past the header. Before the 6th left, Okafor came to my station and gave me a data chip. He said it was the full documentation of the 8-month period, everything Reeves had been filing under the journalism license, everything that had been marked unverified low priority. He said, "There's more coming. Not from us." But the compact wasn't the only group that decided the collapse was an opportunity. The next thing won't be in margin sector. Then, he left. I held the data chip for a long time. 11 ships went back the way they had come, plus the transport vessels carrying 412 people to somewhere that would take them. I watched them go on the sensor array. The one running on 3 drives. The one with the hull scoring like a record of all the things that had been survived. Growing smaller in the display until the distance made them indistinguishable from the background. Prethon said, "Sublegate. Should I put us back on our original heading?" I thought about the original heading. The observation rotation. The quarterly reports. The maintenance logs about the coolant manifold. The bureau functionary. The comfortable assumption of things having dissolved. File a course extension request, I said. Bureau of Emerging Civilizations, Standard Observational Follow-up Protocol. Tell them we've had a significant development and we're staying in sector. They'll want a summary. Tell them it's complicated. I picked up my broth. They won't read past the header.